All glory go to the Creator. It's an honor to be here today. But I love the theme, American healing. Well, first, let's think about something. Where did America come from? Have it always been America? Or was it just created to be America? Who are the real Americans? America keep changing and changing and changing. Let's go back in time when the American Indians looked like I look and roamed the southeast part of the United States freely. I love what the mayor said. We have to tell the truth. We cannot heal America until we fix the foundation. Can we start right there?
Hawa bless, beautiful people. Tawada. Heya. Heya. Ampetu washte. Familia. This is part 5 of the Indigenous American to African American series. I'm so excited to present this, these next 2 or 3 videos that I got coming. Mashaha, first of all, to Chief Warhorse for opening up and reminding us of our foundation here in America. These next 2 parts, I'm going to call it a paper genocide special. We're going to break old assumptions and indoctrinations. We're about to get real deep, fam. And I feel these next parts will make it unquestionable who were the real American natives or aboriginals. Your ancestors are calling out to you. Do you hear them? The time is here. No more classifications. No more tags or made up races. Know who you are. You know it's part of your family stories. Wake up. And I call out to any so-called scholar watching this, hearing this right now. If you still not convinced, even with the last 4 parts of this series and the other information out now around the plane, you better pay close attention to these next parts. The gig is up. Isaiah 43. Let's begin.
First and foremost, I want to say thank you for allowing myself and my family. Well, I'm appreciative to be here amongst all of my family at this point. Thank you. Yeah, this is. I will not necessarily keep this brief, but I will keep it as short as I can for just telling you guys how appreciative I am to be here. And there was a certain point in my life where I had come almost at a crossroads with my dad, my sister, my friends, my grandparents. And I had no idea kind of what direction to go into because I had lost a sense of a foundation that I know I had lost a long time ago. And knowing that my mom passed and left me such a powerful, empowering family, such a standing rock, as well as all of the United States nation. I mean, to be a part of it now, and not just outside supporter, but knowing that this is family for life. And blood couldn't make us any closer. And our journeys have been directed in so many different ways, but yet we're still standing here August 23rd, 2018, embracing each other as if we haven't lost any time. And it's really special for me to be here because I lost my mom at a very, very young age, and I had no idea that I would end up belonging to almost 4 different families. My dad's side, my grandparents' side, my mom's side, and ultimately my own family that I'm starting now with my young daughter, Azori Elizabeth Irving, who I named after my mom. But this is a very special day simply because I get to really, really be intimate with a lot of individuals that I haven't necessarily met face to face all of yet. But the fact that the support has been there, even without necessarily knowing each other, shows how special and what it means to be a native of this country and be a Native American. And for me, I had no idea. I had no idea about the history. I had no idea how inclusive this group is and what it means to be part of Standing Rock and be part of the United Sioux Nation. So I want to thank all you guys for hosting myself, my sister, my best friend Brett Carroll, my grandparents, and the fact that I get to meet my family finally. I mean, you guys have no idea. This is finally meeting my mom's family, and now I'm with you guys forever, and I hope that you don't mind that, because I don't mind it either. So.
This man right here, I often said, Heather, got me teary-eyed right now to see him. Yeah, man, I'm tears. These are tears of joy right here, Heather.
Okay.
Tears of gold.
Yeah, man.
And in all due respect to every race, niggas know black people don't crack. Like black don't crack.
Yeah, black don't crack. That was
It rhymes.
yeah.
Shit.
What's it inconsistent?
Well, indigenous don't crack.
Indigenous
The natives don't crack.
The natives don't
You can
crack.
see a native and he could be 90 years old and still look like he's 50. I'm talking for the natives.
Yeah.
I like when
When it comes to talking about African Americans, I have no education with that. Period. I don't. I don't. I'm not even connecting to that no more. Because that's a system. That's like connecting. Say, hey, he's a bad guy. You don't hang with him. Oh, hey, I'm gonna find out for myself. I'm not African American at all. My folks is not from Africa, and a lot of people in this room, folks ain't from Africa. Might be a couple, but people just don't understand. I asked my grandma, like, "Yo, grandma, what's your background?" She like, Redfoot and Blacktail Indian. What? Yeah, my mother and my father did. We 100% Indians. Ask my other grandma, we got Cherokee in us, and European and Italian, a little Dominican. It's crazy. I'm like, what the fuck? That's why I'm over Africa. Y'all look at me funny, like, nigga, I'm African. Like, you're not though. Like, you're not. 80% of slaves already here. It was natives. It's crazy.
80. Where you get that number from?
Right.
Shit, I just checked the books.
Which book?
Yeah.
I got a whole laptop full of this shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, just for me reading. It's not a solid book like, hey, there's only 1,000 slaves came here. And nah, nigga, you gotta read. You have to literally read. Like, I'm so deep into it, I don't think about a slave ship. I think about what was a slave ship called? Jesus. What the fuck was a slave ship called that Christopher Columbus was on? Who funded that slave ship? Who paid for that boat? Like, what was these folks' race? Like, what was their background?
So I just wanted to start out reading from this couple of books here. This first one called Slavery as it Relates to the Negro or African Race, examined in the light of circumstances, history, and the Holy Scriptures, with an account of the origin of the black man's color, causes of his state of servitude, and traces of his character, as well in ancient as in modern times, with strictures on abolitionism. All right, so this was written in 1843. Just want to read here. It says, let's start from here, this part. In accordance with this statement of Josephus, in rendering a reason why God called the two first human beings by but one name, and that name being Adam, or the red man, and woman, red, right? We find that the Hebrew language establishes that the words Adam, Adama, Adami, and Adama have all similar meaning. First, Adam, as above, signifies earthy man, red. Second, Adama signifies red earth or blood. Third, Adami signifies my man, red, earthy, human. Fourth, Atman signifies earthy, red, or bloody, all which words are of the same class and spring from the same root, which was Adam, signifying red or copper color. Again, red or copper color. We're just talking about copper colored races, right, of America. Webster's Dictionary, 1828. American, a native of America, originally applied to the aboriginals or copper colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. Again, copper colored races. From a view of this fact, it is difficult to account for the reason of the name of the first man and woman unless they were created red, instead of white or black, as it is well known that the Hebrew language is governed in its power of naming visible existences, as of animals, fowls, fishes, by their appearances or natures, and frequently by both, as in the case of the name Adam, which not only represents the hue of his skin, but that also of his intellectual existence or human nature. Thus, this Jewish historian, as well as the genius of the Hebrew language, furnishes us with a clue like the golden thread in the labyrinth of the subterranean palace of ancient Thebes, leading to the right conclusion on this subject, namely that Adam, with all the antediluvian race, were red or a copper color people. Again, that Adam and all the antediluvian race, or the people who lived before the flood, we're talking about you, ancient aboriginal of America, right? You were red or a copper colored people, and you still are. And regarding copper colored races, right? In the book, we got this in part one or two of the series, Crania Americana, a comparative view of skulls of various aboriginal nations of North and South America. In regards to the Inca, the Peruvians, down towards the bottom middle, it says their complexion is a dark brown and their hair long black and rather coarse. Down in the bottom, it says, to these observations of Clavigero may be added a few others from Humboldt, who describes them as possessing a swarthy and copper color. Again, a swarthy and copper color. Swarthy means black or dark skin, and copper color. And in another part of this book, it says here, now as the Jews are red or a dark copper colored race, a dark copper colored race, really? Because the Jews that they show us today, these Ashkenazi Jews, they don't look dark copper colored. But they're talking about Hebrews here, not Jews. There's no J's in Old Paleo Hebrew. All right. Reading from this book called An Abridged History, Africa and Her People by Rudy Johnson. And it says here, Noah, whatever may have been the hue of his complexion, was the father of sons of very different complexions. Japhet most likely was the white one, and from him descended the Caucasian race, as we shall presently show, the fairest of the human races. So the Ashkenazi Jew, as we mentioned earlier, they come from Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz is a son of Gog, I believe, from Magog, but I believe it's Gog. And those are both sons of Japhet. They're not even Shem. The Hebrews come out of Shem. So these are not Hebrews that are in the state of Israel today. And the continuing says Shem was copper colored. Again, Shem was copper colored. Who also is copper colored? Here we go again. American, a native of America, originally applied to the aboriginals or copper colored races found here by the Europeans. Alright, Shem was copper colored and the progenitor of the Hebrews and of the copper colored races. Alright, of you. You are of Shem. When the third son was presented to Noah, he exclaimed, Ham, example, black, for the signification of the Hebrew term means heat, hence black, and from Ham descended all the dark, complex races, as we shall see from the countries they inhabited and for which they were divinely adapted by color and constitution. From the book we have here, American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West by Joshua Priest. And it says here, but as it respects the complexions of these heads, now they're talking about Shem, Japhet, and Ham, of the nations of the earth, we remark as follows. Shem was undoubtedly a red or copper colored man. Again, Shem was undoubtedly a red or copper colored man, which was the complexion of all the antediluvians. This conclusion is drawn from the fact that the nations inhabiting the countries named as being settled or peopled by the descendants of Shem have always been and now are of that caste. We deem this fact as conclusive that such was also their progenitor. When we're talking about the copper colored races of America, right? Shem, as that the great and distinguishing features and complexion of nations changed not materially. Shem was the father of the Jewish race or Hebrews, who are of the same hue, varying, it is true, some being of a darker and some of a lighter shade. Right? Different kinds of hues, this copper color, but all the same, right? Are arising from secret and undefinable principles placed beyond the research of man, and also from amalgamation by marriage with white and with the darker nations, as the African. So it's separate, right? than the African, these copper-colored descendants of Shem. Different. But to corroborate our opinion that the antediluvians were of red or copper complexion, we bring the well-known statement of Josephus that Adam, the first of men, was a red man, made of red earth, called virgin earth, because of its beauty and pureness. The word Adam, he also says, signifies that color which is red. Again, copper-colored races.
At that time, there was a lot of people that was using what we call pencil genocide. In other words, they were changing documents in the town halls and this and that, and unless you had some question about it, you didn't even know it. So, for example, in my dad's family, my Aunt Marion, my Aunt Josephine, and my Uncle Louis were down as Indian. Uncle Lawrence and my father were down as black. My mother's birth certificate, she was born on Cogswell Street, which is Pawcatuck, Connecticut. And the doctor, knowing that she wasn't black, naturally, because he was very well familiar with the Babcock family, put her down as white. And a lot of us were put down as white just so we would not have that stigma of being black.
From the book Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. I just wanted to emphasize something he says right in the beginning of the book, what his purpose is for writing this. And it says, the primary purpose of this study is not to write a comprehensive account of Native American African relations, but rather to establish a sound empirical and conceptual basis for further study in this area. And more importantly, to demonstrate beyond any doubt that old assumptions must be set aside. All right? Your old assumptions, your own hijacks, these must be set aside. This latter is especially true as regards the extent of Native American African mixture and the significant genetic contribution of Americans to present day black, in quotes, right? Black or Afro-American or African-American in quotes. So he's telling you again that you have to really set aside old assumptions of what you think a so-called black or African-American is when it comes to how much extent of Native American mixture there is in you, right? Talking about you, right? So-called black, so-called Afro-American populations in the Caribbean, Brazil, the United States, and elsewhere. Again, this latter is especially true as regards the extent of Native American African mixture and the significant genetic contribution of Americans to present-day black or Afro-American populations in the Caribbean, Brazil, the United States, and elsewhere.
People of blended backgrounds have always had to negotiate their identity in sometimes complex, even confusing ways. Much of the confusion that has affected relations between African American and Native American people is rooted in the early American experience. To most white Europeans in the colonies, people of mixed black and Indian background were simply colored or mulattoes.
And in 18th century parlance, at least in New England, mulatto means a person of indefinite pigmentation. That indefinite pigmentation could be a result of racial mixing. That's not necessarily the case. That person could be a mixed European Indian, could be a mixed European African, could be an African Indian mixture, or could simply be an Indian person who Europeans assumed had a vague sort of brownish skin color.
Chapter 7. The classification of Native Americans as mulattoes in Anglo-North America. Contemporary scholarly and popular literature in the United States has largely ignored the significance of widespread Native American ancestry among the Afro-Americans, right, so-called Negro or Black, and also of African ancestry among many Native groups. Dodge the hijack. And I'll show you why I say that later on. The consequences of this neglect are far-reaching, and this is especially true in relations to studies of the evolution of music, folk tales, social organization, and other aspects of culture.
Around my neighborhood used to think I was Cuban at the time because I looked different. So I guess the way it works is people are so used to seeing what is depicted as an Indian within the movies, the old movies and things. So if you don't look that way, they don't expect you to be Indian. They think you're either black or Hispanic or something else.
So in this book, right, Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes, I just really wanted to show, because people say that, oh, you probably read that in that book by Jack Forbes, because what I want to show you is that these are not his opinions. The reason I like his book mainly, not because of the information he writes in it, because of the sources which he puts here. And every chapter, almost every paragraph has a footnote, and you can go verify each source. It's all in his book at the end. All right. For example, down here in the bottom, you see I have it highlighted. It says, as early as the late 19th century, the 19th annual report of the Bureau of American Ethnology noted that a considerable proportion of the blood of the southern Negroes of the U.S. is unquestionably Indian. Unquestionably Indian. And I just wanted to show you this example here. As it says in this book here, it's actually journal or letters that were written to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution by J.W. Powell. He had a whole bunch of these volumes. They're called the Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology. This is volume 19, or the 19th annual, as you see here, report. This comes in two parts. In part one of this, which was written in 1900, it says in some part of the book, it says, and I have the book, so I'm the one who made this image. So, in regards to the contact between the two races, by which such stories could be borrowed one by the other, it is not commonly known that in all the southern colonies, Indian slaves were bought and sold, and kept in servitude, and worked in the fields side by side with Negroes up to the time of Revolution. So they're saying there was Indians working in the fields, right, in all these plantations, all the way until 1776 at least. All right, so which one was the Indian and which one was the so-called black or Negro? Well, how can you tell them apart? How come? I mean, we've never seen any difference growing up, right? It's always showing us a so-called Negro as a slave. All right. Continuing, it says, not to go back to the Spanish period, when such things were the order of the day, and they're talking about, and we're gonna see in the next parts of this video series, how the Spanish and Portuguese was enslaving the American Indian by the thousands, We find the Cherokee as early as 1693 complaining that their people were being kidnapped by slave hunters. Hundreds of captured Tuscarora and nearly the whole tribe of the Apalachee were distributed as slaves among the Carolina colonists in the early part of the 18th century, while the Natchez and others shared a similar fate in Louisiana. We know the whole Natchez was chained up and sent to the Caribbean. We read that in Lies My Teacher Told Me. And as late as least of 1776, Cherokee prisoners of war were still sold to the highest bidder for the same purpose. At one time it was charged against the governor of South Carolina that he was provoking a general Indian war by his encouragement of slave hunts. Furthermore, as the coast tribes dwindled, they were compelled to associate and intermarry with the Negroes until they finally lost their identity. That's how they're describing it here, but it was always you, and we're classed with that race. So they're saying the Indians became the Negro. That's what they're saying here. We're classed with that race, or classified together, so that a considerable proportion of the blood of the southern Negroes is unquestionably Indian. Again, so that a considerable proportion of the blood of the southern Negroes is unquestionably Indian. You are Indian. It's unquestionable. Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, Volume 19. A considerable proportion of the blood of the Southern Negro is unquestionably Indian. As you can see here, Ute Warrior, so-called Negro, Ananda Lewis, MTV News, Creek, Blackfoot. So again, you see how we were able to back that up. Also, it says here the 1937 doctoral dissertation of James Hugo Johnston, belatedly published many years later, went further. There developed in the colonial period much intermixture of the Indian and Negro slave, Negro, parentheses, that doesn't say African. The class commonly called the mulatto is the result in many instances of the union of three racial elements. To the visitor in the South, the physical characteristics of many Negro slaves bore witness to their Indian origin. All right, that's what Mr. James Hugo Johnston said in a 1937 doctoral dissertation, and we actually went over that on part 1 of this series, I believe. All right, you can go back. Continues, says, the end of Indian slavery came with the final absorption of the blood of the Indian by the more numerous Negro slave or other so-called Indians that were coming from other parts of America. But the blood of the Indian did not become extinct in the slave states, for it continued to flow in the veins of the Negro. Again, but the blood of the Indian did not become extinct in the slave states, for it continued to flow in the veins of the Negro. It is you. It still is you. In an article published in the Journal of Negro History, Johnston remarked, where the Negro was brought into contact with the American Indian, the blood of the two races intermingled. The Indian has not disappeared from the land, but it is now part of the Negro population of the United States.
When we were coming up, it was a bad stigma, I guess, to be Native American. And so, I mean, you was just classified as black, or that's the way you went. And, you know, a lot of the older people, they never told you. I mean, it was a long time before I really found out what my heritage was.
A lot of people that go through the museum, then they go into the portrait gallery, the last exhibit that you're going to see on the second floor, and there's portraits of Mashantucket Pequot people. And they walk in and they're like, they're not Indian, they're black.
An American.
If you look at the old censuses, you will see people who clearly we know are of Native American ancestry categorized as colored people or mulattoes.
We were sitting on a plane one day, my wife and I talking Cherokee, and a lot of the African Americans didn't know what we were. A lot of the Hispanics didn't know if we were Jamaican or Cuban or Latino, and the white passengers in the plane certainly didn't have a clue because that's the first time they ever heard Cherokee spoken. So we thought that's unique. You know, it takes a Cherokee to understand Cherokee. So I thought that was real amusing. We sitting on the plane talking, everybody staring at us. I don't think they were staring at us because I was black and Indian. They were staring at us because they didn't know what we were saying, conversing in, or what language.
So the author tells us here, it says, long ago, when first working with my own Powhatan Lenape people of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and surrounding areas, I discovered that the meaning of racial terms was a controversial issue. I learned that terms such as mulatto and colored, again, mulatto and colored, this is very important, we're gonna talk about this, right, were used or had been used in Virginia in a quite different way from their usage in most books, including modern dictionaries. All right, it was being used back in those times, used differently. I also discovered that many questions were not answerable within the context of the latter, such as what do you call a person of mixed American, European, and African ancestry? No one provided any answer because it seems the American mixture with the African was generally subordinated to a focus upon or a fascination with only the black-white nexus. All right, so he continues saying the modern dictionaries all stated that a mulatto was the child of a black and a white or someone of mixed black and white ancestry. But where did that leave those who were also part Indian? All right, this is important what he's trying to get to, all right? So he says, in any case, I discovered that Native American descendants had been legally defined as mulattoes in Virginia in 1705 without having any African ancestry. Again, they were calling Indian mulattoes in Virginia in 1705 without having any African ancestry. In any case, I discovered that Native American descendants had been legally defined as mulattoes in Virginia in 1705 without having any African ancestry. Again, Indians or so-called Native American or American natives were being called mulattoes in Virginia in 1705. We're going to run into this a lot in a lot of different cases, different years. Again, without having any African ancestry. What does that mean? Because they tell us again that mulatto is supposed to be an African mixed with a white European. That's what's supposed to be a mulatto. All right, so how do you get mulattoes without any African ancestry? All right, they was just judging you as a mulatto, not because of they thought you were African mixed with a white European, just because you were light skinned or lighter than what a darker hue, copper colored person. You know what I mean? All right, so he's saying that with here, thus I knew that the dictionaries were wrong and that there was a lot that was hidden from view by the way most authors had written about the southern United States, about slavery, and about colored people. I later discovered also that the same thing was true as regards to the Caribbean, Brazil, and much of the rest of the Americas. All right, the rest of the Americas. By way of illustration and attempting to grapple with the problem of black, African, Native American mixture, and especially with the question of to what extent African Americans throughout the Americas are part American Indian, it is first necessary to focus upon a clarification of such racial or ethnic terms as were used in the colonial and early national periods. This is important because this is the tags they were labeling you. These weren't classifying you as race. They were just what they were seeing as color, and that couldn't determine your race. They were just guessing based on what you looked like. So they say like terms like mulatto, pardo. We hear that a lot in the Spanish books. Colored, free colored, negro, sambo or sambo, musti, and mestizo. As noted, many modern writers, whether popular or scholarly, have simply assumed that they could transfer 16th, 17th, or 18th century racial terms to contemporary usage without any critical examination of the meaning. All right, for example, it has been assumed generally that a mulatto of, let us say, 1600 would be the same racial background as a mulatto of 1865 or of 1900, or that a colored person, right, right, like your ancestors are in their census records, right, of 1830 would be the same as a colored person of 1930. All right, so they're saying, it's not the same because these were just tags that were putting on people. It didn't classify their race. Moreover, it has been assumed that terms such as free Negro and free colored can be used interchangeably, and that one could in more recent usage substitute free black for either of these. Either of these could be a so-called Negro or black person. That's what he's saying. I'm going to quickly read from this book. It's called Indians of North America, the Powhatan Tribes by Christian F. Feast. So on page 69 of this book, in regards to the black coats in Virginia that they were established in, I believe, let me see, it tells years, 1705. All right, so it says down here in the bottom, it says, at the same time, however, the black code classified those Indians living outside the reservations as free persons of color. So they made an imaginary line, right? And they created the reservations. So if you were outside of that imaginary line, you were actually, instead of called an Indian or classified as an Indian, you were being classified of a free person of color. What does that tell you? That that person was a so-called Negro, right? Who they calling colored this whole time in the United States, right? You know that, right? So look how they play with words, simply because you're on one side of the fence. A legal status they shared with free blacks and mulattoes. So a legal status they shared with free blacks and mulattoes. So they're telling you straight up that the term free colored actually meant Indians, because it says that they met the same legal status as free blacks, another term, right? Another tag they put on you, and mulattoes. Again, mulatto, right? That word mulatto, we've already gone over that. All right, we see it again here. Indians so classified were now prohibited from hunting on lands claimed by white Virginians. They were also barred from holding public office and from serving as witnesses in courts of law. Marriages between Indians and whites had already been outlawed in 1691, despite the example of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. Now, children with one Indian parent were defined as mulattoes, whether the other parent was black or white. So if you get an Indian, which is a so-called Negro, right, with another black or another so-called Indian, right? They play with all these words here, but we're talking about the same people. They considered that a mulatto just because one was classified as an Indian. So it's not about just white people mixing with Africans. That's not the whole definition of mulatto. We see that it was applied different here as well. Moreover, all children were classified as mulattoes if they had one black parent, grandparent, or great grandparent. All right, so if you have a little bit of so-called Negro in you, you are automatically a mulatto. Only a thin line, a bloodline, now separated a reservation Indian who possessed acknowledged rights and privileges from an off-reservation one who was legally designated as colored. He was legally designated as colored. They're talking about Indians and had a much lower social status. Although the latter were not enslaved, some plantation owners probably forced their Indian servants into marriage with blacks so that the children could be claimed as slaves. Indian children claimed as slaves.
If you back up to pre-Jacksonian America, and the time of Indian removal, there's no advantage to identifying as Indian, unless it was very important for you to keep your family and kin and nation together. If you were most interested in remaining where you were, because that was sacred ground where you were living, because you did not want to be removed, then there was advantage of identifying as African. Which means then you would not be rounded up, put on the rolls, and sent west, but you could stay right where you were. Of course, there is a disadvantage at this time of identifying as African because you run the risk then of being enslaved. But at least you wouldn't be removed necessarily.
Around the turn of the century, the Cherokee were once again part of a government operation known as the Dawes Commission. And at that time, the land which we held in common at one time for time immemorial became individual allotments to Cherokee citizens.
Indeed, the whole construction of the Dawes Roll by which Indian nations were allotted is based on the assumption that blood quantum, that is the degree of any particular ancestry, white, Indian, black, the degree to which you are one of those determines certain cultural characteristics. That is, how able you are to manage your allotment.
It was at that time that the separation as citizens between black freedmen and Cherokee by blood was made. The Cherokee freedmen, if they were not also Cherokee by blood, were not given an allotment and thus were not part of the Dawes enrollment process.
A lot of knowledge that's been erased. The fact that freedman was never in my vocabulary, I never heard that in terms of a designation of my family history. My father always talked about being of part Choctaw ancestry, but his father, who died in 1940, my grandfather, was on the roll as a Choctaw freedman. The last person in our family who died, who was on the Dawes rolls, just died this year. She was 94. She was a Choctaw freedman newborn. And when I spoke with her, and whenever I would talk to her, she would always talk about, well, Grandma was Indian, of course, but she never, and I'm part Indian, but she never referred to herself as freedman.
Continuing with Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes, he says many colored terms such as dark, swarthy, and brown are also quite ambiguous, as should be obvious, right? Because they will say a dark Indian. So we went over swarthy in past videos. Again, that just means a dark-skinned person or black person, as they would call you, right? In 1756 list of militiamen in Kin and Queen County, Virginia, for example, one finds an addition to fair-complexioned persons: Thomas Delaney as dark, Benjamin Wilson as dark, James Wilmore as brown, John Major as brown, John Kemp as swarthy, but with light hair and freckles, John Evans as dark, and Richard Riddle as dark. All or most of these men were born in Virginia, and several were planters. Were they part American or part African? Certainly, we cannot judge their race from such color reference alone. So you hear what he's saying, right? How they just tagging them like dark, swarty, brown, but that didn't say if they were African. That never says they were African, or just because they were calling these people, you know, that they had to have been mixed with an African. All right, that's what he's trying to let you know, that these historical accounts were just naming these people as what they saw them personally, like, oh, he's darker than a white European, right? So a dark, you know, John Evans, all right? But that's Indians were dark, right? You know, for example, as a quick reminder, we got this in part 1 or 2 of this video series, but from Verrazano's own words, right? Verrazano, famous explorer, this was from written in the 1500s, and he says that when he got to shore, he saw some Indians. Some wear certain garlands, he says, of feathers of birds. They are of dark color, not much unlike the Ethiopian, and hair black and thick and not very long, which they tie together back on their head in the shape of a little tail. Again, down the bottom he says, and he saw some other Indians and learned that these people, that they are also thus of dark color like the others. So all of them are dark color, dark, right? Verrazano.
You can go to any place in the state of Oklahoma, and every place, every few miles up and down the highway, depending upon what nation you're in, you will find all kinds of gift shops and see things, oh, come and get a Cherokee doll, or come play some Choctaw or Creek Nation bingo, and come and do this and do that. And you can go to every one of those shops. You can go to the capital of the Choctaw Nation in Durant, or go to the capital in Tahlequah, and you won't find anything representing the thousands of African people who lived there. Thousands, not just a handful or a few dozen, thousands who were documented on the rolls. Over 20,000 African people were there. They weren't just there and invisible and doing nothing.
So you saying you're not African American, you're more of the indigenous, your grandmother and your grandparents from the Native American tribes. Do you address yourself as Native American? Do you address yourself as black? Do you address yourself as African American?
I'm other.
So you're other.
I'm uneducated. I'm uneducated. So for me to sit here like a college professor or a professor, I'm wrong. I'm uneducated. I'm confused. You know what I'm saying? But I'm damn sure not black. You're not gonna call me black. My grandmother's not Crayola. Like,
So
no,
then,
I'm connected to a tribe. I'm from a tribe, not a country. It's a big difference. Different laws, different everything. Like, big difference. Yeah. But I don't want to make niggas feel like I'm on some other shit because I say I don't want to connect with African Americans. Like I'm saying fuck black. It's nothing like that. It's that my eyelids is up. And when your eyelids is up, you read about everything you put in your mouth. You say out your mouth. You walk, you talk, and you conversate with. And I'm just up. I'm awoke. That's just what it is. I don't live for money every day no more. I live for the truth. That's just a difference now.
I am a Mashantucket Pequot tribal member. I became federally recognized in 1993. Previous to that, I was always known to be a Afro-American. I was told as I was younger that we have native blood, if you will, and relatives of the Narragansett and the Pequots. I remember as I was growing up, the question was asked a lot if I'm mulatto because of my light skin, and I'm like, no, there are no Caucasians in my family as I know of. But it came clear to me when I was told more of my native side. So that explained to me why the skin is so light.
If you move up to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, what's the advantage there of identifying as either African or Indian? Well, this is all tied up in the civil rights movement. The 60s or 70s, the currency there was blackness.
I had a lot of problems in the black community, and they got progressively worse as I got older, and I think part of it was the knowledge that black people were having, the raising of black consciousness with the Black Panther Party and Black Power, and I remember Angela Davis. I remember AIM and Wounded Knee.
Where's claiming Indian ancestry going to get you anyway, when in the 50s, the movement for civil rights is for African Americans? The Brown versus Board of Ed, the civil rights case of 1957, the voting rights case, the civil rights case of 64, the civil rights piece of legislation, Voting Rights Act of 65, those are directed to African Americans. So what does it gain you to declare yourself as Indian? Not till I'd say the late 60s, 70s at least.
Here in Lexington, Kentucky, it's so important. People honestly don't look at me on the street and see my name, Victor Hassing. Oh yeah, Narragansett. Probably doesn't dawn on them. It probably says, African American by virtue of my pigmentation.
Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. It says here, Frank H. Russell in his The Free Negro in Virginia wrote in 1913, and we got that book, that one of the ways in which the free colored population grew was by the mixture of Indians and Negroes. He said also that there is no doubt that a considerable element in the free colored population of the 19th century was of Indian extraction. Again, there is no doubt. There is no doubt. Go read this in the Free Negro in Virginia book by Frank H. Russell from 1913. We have the PDF. There is no doubt that a considerable element in the free colored population of the 19th century was of Indian extraction.
I'm not going to tell someone you are or you aren't who you say you are. I think that we need to have fundamental respect for people as individuals as well as communities. And when someone says to me, I am an Indian, I'm an African Indian, I am white, I accept what those people tell me. I think that the whole notion of ascribing ethnicity to people is something that we should have left in the 19th century.
Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. It says here, one can also cite other authorities whose work caused them to consider the intermixture of African and American racial stocks. Helen T. Catterall, in her work on slavery in Virginia, noted that we have shown that the first slaves were Indians, not Negroes. Again, the first slaves were Indians, not Negroes, and that the enslavement of Americans continued for many, many years. In 1903, a historian of New Jersey noted that unions between Indians and Negroes were so commonly frequent, indeed, as to have left permanent impress upon many families of Negroes of the present day. E.B. Reuter recognized in 1927 that African-American mixture had taken place within slavery and said the Indian slaves were gradually absorbed into the black population. And the real truth is that it's always been you. According to Ashley Montagu from 1944, she says, with the discovery of the New World, intermixture between the Negroes and the Indigenous of the West Indies began almost at once. All right, Negroes, right? It must be supposed that these Negroes, and in parentheses it says here, from different parts of Africa, were already very thoroughly mixed among themselves with the Indians. So she's saying that these Negroes were already mixed with Indians of the islands and of the mainland of Brazil by the time most of them reached North America. So she's saying that these so-called Negroes that are supposed to be African already had mixture of natives in Brazil, already were mixed with Brazil. That's because in reality, these were Brazilians. These were island people. These were the original aboriginals of America. They didn't come from Africa. You got to follow the trail and you'll see what I'm talking about. The mingling of Negroes and Indians, of course, occurred first in the West Indies. And then it says, it is significant that Montagu recognized that many of the slaves coming not directly from Africa, but from the Caribbean. Again, not directly from Africa, as they've been telling us all our lives in these textbooks, but from the Caribbean. Might have had American ancestry, not might, it does. So when they're saying that the Pequots were mixing with the Negroes, they're just talking about other Native or American aboriginals that they're bringing from South America or the Caribbean, Central America, or other colonies they had. Thus, it may be seen that not only was there much mixture between different varieties of Negroes in the islands, varieties of Negroes, right? They're not saying Africans, but also complete mixture with the indigenous Indians and sometimes with Indians who were not indigenous to these islands. Montagu also recognized that once the people of African descent had reached North America, intermixture with Americans continued. The available evidence indicates that ethnic mixture between Indians and Negroes has been of vastly greater proportions that has hitherto been realized. The American Negro population of today is a composite of African, white, and Indian elements. So they're always going to add the hijack African in her mind because she thinks all so-called Negroes come from Africa. And that's one of our own biggest hijack that we have to dodge, is that, you know, we assume, because we've been taught that all so-called Negro people, or people of dark skin, come out of Africa. And that's not true. You know, in the Americas, we have the environment that makes melanated people, where melanated people live, up to the darkest hues, as you can see in this chart. You see some in South America, Peru and Brazil, Guyana, Suriname, exactly what the black tribes are described in these anthropological books. Alright, so not just Africa. So I think I'm gonna end part 5 right here. You know, I want all of us to take a break, including myself. I know it's a lot of information, and I'm about to get even deeper. So please continue to the next part 6 and part 7. And you know, I have a lot of information coming. Thank you for sticking around. You know, almost an hour here with me, and please continue. Hawa bless.